What happens when a predator becomes the prey, when centuries of ancestral fury awaken in the heart of a man who has nothing left to lose? Today, I'll tell you the story of a master who thought he could hunt human beings for sport, until he chose the wrong target. If stories of justice, courage, and ancestral legacy captivate you, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our incredible narratives. The morning mist clung to the trees like ghostly fingers, creating an oppressive atmosphere in the depths of the Louisiana bayou. The year was 1847, and on the vast Woodbridge plantation, a sinister tradition was about to begin once again. Master Augustus Woodbridge stood on the wraparound porch of his imposing mansion, a cruel smile playing across his weathered face. At 52, he was a man who had built his fortune on the suffering of others, and today promised to be particularly entertaining. The mansion itself was a testament to his wealth and cruelty. 3 stories of white-painted wood and columns that gleamed like bones in the morning light, surrounded by manicured gardens that were maintained by hands that would never know freedom. The architecture spoke of old southern grandeur, but beneath its elegant facade lay the dark heart of an empire built on human misery. Every brick had been laid by enslaved hands, every board cut and shaped by men who would never own homes of their own. The very beauty of the place was a mockery, a cruel reminder of what could be achieved when human beings were treated as nothing more than tools. "Gather the dogs, Samuel," he called to his overseer, a thin, nervous man who had learned never to question his master's darker impulses. "Today we hunt." Samuel Hartwell had served the Woodbridge family for nearly 2 decades, watching as Augustus had transformed from merely cruel to something approaching monstrous. The overseer's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his worn leather hat, knowing that what was about to unfold would haunt his dreams for weeks to come. He had witnessed these hunts before, had seen good men broken by the terror of being pursued like animals through the unforgiving swamp. The ritual had begun 15 years ago, shortly after Augustus had returned from a trip to Europe where he had been exposed to the darker entertainments of the aristocracy. He had come back changed, his already cruel nature twisted into something far more sinister. The first hunt had been almost accidental, a runaway slave pursued into the swamp for sport rather than simple recapture. But Augustus had discovered that he enjoyed the chase, the terror in his victim's eyes, the absolute power he wielded over another human being's fate. The plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of swampland and cotton fields, a kingdom where Woodbridge's word was absolute law. Spanish moss draped the ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, and the air hung thick with humidity and the ever-present threat of violence. The main house sat on a slight rise, overlooking the slave quarters that stretched along the muddy road like a scar across the landscape. Beyond that lay the cotton fields, and beyond those, the dark wall of cypress trees that marked the beginning of the bayou, a place where civilized men feared to tread, but where desperate souls sometimes found their only hope of escape. Augustus had inherited the plantation from his father, but where the elder Woodbridge had been content with mere profit, Augustus had developed appetites that went far beyond financial gain. He had traveled extensively in his youth, spending time in the darker corners of Europe, where he had learned that wealth could purchase experiences that ordinary men could never imagine. Those experiences had awakened something in him that grew hungrier with each passing year. The morning air carried the scent of magnolia blossoms and jasmine, but underneath those sweet fragrances lay something else, the smell of fear, of sweat, of lives lived in constant terror. It was a smell that Augustus had grown to associate with power, with the absolute control he exercised over every aspect of life on his plantation. In the slave quarters, a different kind of tension filled the air. Word had spread quickly through the cramped wooden cabins that lined the dirt road behind the main house. The master was choosing his prey. Mothers pulled their children closer, and men who had spent their lives learning to make themselves invisible tried to shrink even further into the shadows. The quarters themselves were a study in deliberate degradation. Each cabin housed multiple families, with barely enough space for the occupants to lie down. The walls were thin and poorly constructed, offering little protection from the elements or privacy from the constant surveillance of the overseers. A single well-provided water for the entire community, and the smell of unwashed bodies and inadequate sanitation hung heavy in the air. The buildings had been constructed with the minimum materials necessary to provide basic shelter, nothing more. There were no windows, only small openings that could be shuttered against storms. The floors were bare earth, and the roofs leaked during the frequent rains that swept across the bayou. In winter, the cabins provided little warmth, and in summer, they became stifling ovens that trapped the heat and humidity. Among the enslaved people, there was one who stood apart. Cale had arrived at Woodbridge Plantation only 3 months ago, purchased at a slave auction in New Orleans, where Augustus had outbid several other planters for the privilege of owning him. Unlike the others, who had been born into bondage or had spent years learning to hide their true selves, Cale carried himself with a quiet dignity that unnerved the overseers. He was tall and lean, with skin the color of burnished copper and eyes that seemed to hold secrets older than the plantation itself. His hands bore the calluses of hard labor, but they moved with a precision and grace that spoke of skills beyond those required for field work. The other enslaved people whispered about him in hushed tones. There was something different about this man, something that spoke of distant lands and forgotten freedoms. Cale's arrival had not gone unnoticed by Augustus, who prided himself on his ability to break even the strongest spirits. He had watched with growing interest as his overseers failed to crush the newcomer's quiet defiance, had noted the way other slaves seemed to draw strength from Cale's presence. It was this very quality that had made him the perfect choice for today's entertainment. The auction where Augustus had purchased Cale had been particularly brutal, even by the standards of such events. Families had been torn apart, children sold away from their mothers, husbands separated from wives. But through it all, Cale had maintained his composure, his dignity intact despite the degradation of being examined like livestock. Augustus had been intrigued by this display of inner strength, seeing it as a challenge to be overcome. "You there," Samuel's voice cracked like a whip across the morning air. "The new one, step forward." Cale emerged from the shadows of his cabin, moving with a fluid grace that reminded the overseer uncomfortably of a predator. There was no fear in his dark eyes, only a watchful intelligence that made Samuel's skin crawl. Behind him, other faces peered out from doorways and windows, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and relief that they had not been chosen. The selection process was always the same. Augustus would choose his quarry based on some perceived slight or simply on a whim. Sometimes it was a slave who had shown too much independence, sometimes one who had tried to learn to read, sometimes simply someone who had caught his attention. The randomness of it was part of the terror. No one could predict when they might be chosen, which meant everyone lived in constant fear. "Master Woodbridge has chosen you for today's exercise," Samuel stammered, unable to meet Cale's steady gaze. "You'll have a 30-minute head start. Use it wisely." The rules of Woodbridge's twisted game were simple and horrifying. A chosen slave would be given a head start into the treacherous swampland that bordered the plantation. Then Augustus, accompanied by his hunting dogs and armed overseers, would pursue them through the maze of cypress trees, Spanish moss, and alligator-infested waters. The hunt would continue until sunset, when the quarry would either be captured or would reach the old Indian burial ground at the heart of the swamp. If the hunted managed to survive until sunset and reach the sacred ground, they would theoretically win their freedom, though in 15 years of this sadistic sport, none had ever succeeded. Most were caught within hours, returned to face punishments that served as warnings to the others. Some simply disappeared into the swamp, their fate left to the imagination, though Augustus always claimed they had been killed by wild animals or had drowned in the treacherous waters. The hunting party consisted of Augustus himself, 6 armed overseers, and a pack of specially trained bloodhounds that had been bred for tracking human scent. The dogs were kept hungry before each hunt, their natural aggression heightened by their empty bellies. The overseers carried rifles, pistols, and nets, equipped for capture rather than killing. Augustus preferred his prey alive when possible, as it made the eventual punishment more satisfying. The weapons were carefully maintained and regularly tested. Augustus took pride in his arsenal, which included not only firearms, but also various implements designed specifically for the capture and restraint of human beings. Nets with weighted edges, ropes treated with substances that would burn the skin, and other devices that spoke to the systematic nature of his cruelty. As Kyle stood in the morning light, surrounded by the fearful faces of his fellow enslaved people, something stirred deep within his chest. It was a feeling he had kept buried since the day slave traders had torn him from his homeland. A connection to something ancient and powerful that ran deeper than the chains that bound his body. The morning sun seemed to warm his skin in a way that went beyond mere physical sensation, and for a moment he could almost hear the distant sound of drums echoing across the water. The sensation was familiar yet strange, like a half-remembered dream that lingered at the edges of consciousness. He had felt it before, in moments of extreme stress or danger, but never with such intensity. It was as if something within him was awakening, responding to the injustice of his situation with a power that he had never fully understood. 30 minutes! Augustus called from his porch, checking his pocket watch with theatrical precision. And then the real fun begins. But as Cale looked out toward the dark line of trees that marked the beginning of the swamp, he felt no fear. Instead, he felt the awakening of something that had been sleeping in his blood for too long. His grandmother's words echoed in his memory, spoken in a language the white men could never understand. The forest remembers its children, and the ancestors never truly die. The hunt was about to begin, but Augustus Woodbridge had no idea that he was about to face something far more dangerous than a desperate, frightened slave. He was about to confront the descendant of warriors who had never known defeat, a man whose very soul was connected to the ancient spirits of the land itself. As the minutes ticked by, Kyle closed his eyes and let the sounds of the swamp wash over him. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the excited barking of the hunting dogs and the harsh laughter of men who had never known what it meant to fight for their lives. They thought they were the predators. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The swamp welcomed Kyle like an old friend returning home after a long absence. As soon as his bare feet touched the soft, moss-covered earth beyond the plantation's boundaries, something fundamental shifted within him. The oppressive weight of bondage seemed to lift from his shoulders, replaced by an ancient awareness that pulsed through his veins like liquid fire. The transition from cultivated land to wild bayou was stark and immediate. One moment he was walking on packed earth worn smooth by countless feet, and the next he was navigating a world that existed outside the boundaries of human control. The air itself felt different here, thicker, more alive, charged with an energy that made his skin tingle with recognition. The boundary between the plantation and the swamp was marked by more than just a change in vegetation. It was as if he had crossed from one realm into another, From a world governed by human cruelty into one ruled by older, more primal forces. The very quality of light seemed different here, filtered through layers of Spanish moss and cypress branches into a green twilight that spoke of mystery and ancient secrets. Behind him, he could hear the distant sounds of preparation, the baying of hounds, the metallic click of weapons being loaded, the harsh voices of men drunk on the promise of violence. Augustus's voice carried clearly across the morning air as he issued final instructions to his hunting party, his tone filled with the casual cruelty of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. But here, surrounded by the towering cypress trees and the gentle whisper of Spanish moss in the breeze, those sounds seemed to belong to another world entirely. The swamp operated by different rules, older laws that predated the arrival of European settlers and their peculiar institutions. Here, the only authority was that of nature itself, and nature had its own sense of justice. The ecosystem of the bayou was complex and interconnected in ways that most humans never understood. Every creature, from the smallest insect to the largest alligator, played a role in maintaining the delicate balance that had existed for thousands of years. The water levels rose and fell with the seasons, creating an ever-changing landscape of channels, islands, and hidden passages that only the most experienced guides could navigate safely. Kyle moved through the bayou with an instinctive knowledge that surprised even him. His feet found solid ground where others would have stumbled into hidden sinkholes. His hands parted the hanging moss with reverence, as if greeting old friends. The very trees seemed to bend their branches to create clearer pathways, and the wildlife, normally skittish around human presence, watched him pass with curious rather than fearful eyes. With each step deeper into the green twilight of the bayou, memories that weren't quite his own began to surface. They came in flashes at first, the glint of sunlight on a ceremonial spear, the rhythmic pounding of drums around a sacred fire, the proud faces of warriors, painted for battle. But gradually, these fragments began to coalesce into something more coherent, more real. The memories were accompanied by physical sensations that seemed to come from outside his own experience. He could feel the weight of traditional weapons in his hands, could taste the smoke of sacred fires, could hear the chanting of voices raised in ancient songs. It was as if the very act of entering the swamp had awakened something that had been dormant within him, a connection to his heritage that transcended the boundaries of individual memory. He remembered, or perhaps inherited the memory of, his great-grandfather, Ashanti, who had been a war chief in the forests of West Africa before the slavers came. Ashanti had been a man of immense physical presence and spiritual power, capable of moving through the forest like a ghost and striking his enemies with the fury of a thunderstorm. He had fought against the slave traders for years, protecting his village and the surrounding communities until sheer numbers had finally overwhelmed his defenses. The memories were so vivid that Kyle could almost feel the weight of the ceremonial spear in his hands, could almost hear the rhythmic chanting of warriors preparing for battle. These weren't just memories, they were a legacy written in his very DNA, a connection to a heritage that no amount of chains could ever truly break. His grandmother had told him stories of Ashanti's prowess, but she had also spoken of deeper things, of the connection between the warrior and the land, of the spirits that guided those who fought for justice. The stories had been passed down through generations, each telling adding new details while preserving the essential truth. Ashanti had not been merely a warrior, but a spiritual leader, a man who understood that true strength came not from physical prowess alone, but from connection to the ancestors and the natural world. He had been able to call upon forces that his enemies could not understand, drawing power from the very earth beneath his feet. The swamp itself seemed to respond to his presence in ways that defied rational explanation. Birds that had been silent began to call out warnings of approaching danger, their cries forming a complex network of communication that stretched for miles through the bayou. The very air grew thick with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end, and the Spanish moss hanging from the trees began to sway in patterns that had nothing to do with the wind. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the natural sounds of the bayou, he could hear something that made his heart race with recognition. The faint echo of drums that existed only in the realm of ancestral memory. The rhythm was complex and hypnotic, speaking of ceremonies and rituals that had been old when the pyramids were young. It was the heartbeat of his people, the eternal pulse that connected all those who shared his blood. The drumbeat seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very trees were resonating with the ancient rhythm. It was not a sound that could be heard with the ears alone, but something that vibrated through his bones and blood, awakening memories that stretched back through countless generations. Meanwhile, back at the plantation, Augustus Woodbridge was savoring the anticipation like a fine wine. He stood in his study, loading his favorite rifle, a custom-made piece that had never failed to bring down its target. The weapon was a work of art in its own right, with an engraved stock depicting scenes of the hunt and a barrel that gleamed like silver in the morning light. On the walls around him hung the trophies of previous hunts, not just the heads of deer and wild boar, but more disturbing mementos that spoke to the true nature of his character. There were shackles that had belonged to particularly defiant slaves, pieces of clothing torn from those who had tried to escape, and other items that he kept as reminders of his absolute power over the lives of others. The study itself was a shrine to his twisted obsessions. Books on hunting techniques sat alongside volumes on human anatomy and psychology. Maps of the swamp covered one wall, marked with the routes taken by previous quarry and the locations where they had been captured or had disappeared. It was the room of a man who had turned cruelty into an art form, who had studied suffering with the same dedication that others might apply to music or literature. "The dogs are ready, Master," Samuel reported from the doorway, his voice tight with nervous energy. The overseer's face was pale and drawn, and his hands shook slightly as he delivered his report. He had participated in these hunts before, but he had never grown comfortable with the brutality they entailed. Augustus smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Excellent. And our quarry? Any word from the scouts?" "He's moving deeper into the swamp, sir, heading toward the old burial ground, just like the others always do." Samuel paused, then added hesitantly, "Though, the men say there's something different about this one. The way he moves, it's like he knows the swamp, like he belongs there." The scouts were experienced trackers, men who had spent years learning to read the subtle signs that marked a person's passage through the wilderness. They had reported that Cale's trail was unlike any they